Hey Legionaries, it is my distinct pleasure to re-invite our friend here, Celtic War Chief. We're going to be discussing today Peter Zeihan's section on China from the Joe Rogan podcast. Now, recent events have become more salient as lethal aid is being seriously discussed between the PRC and Russia, but I think there are more dynamics to this that we should take into account and thinking about the future. And luckily enough, our friend here is an expert in China as well, and he will be commenting on it. So first of all, thank you so much, Warchief, for coming back on.
Yeah, no problem, man.
Perfect. All right, well, I think he started with, Peter Zeihan made a lot of spurious claims, but one of the most interesting things that he said was the demographic situation. As I'm sure everyone knows in the audience, China has a legacy policy of the one-child policy, which in the 90s was repealed to a two-children policy, right? However, that messes up your population pyramid, and the culture in China is to favor the male to pass on the family name, and so there was a lot of infanticide of women. So there's a huge disproportionate amount of men to women. And so it causes a weird population pyramid. Now, what are the ramifications of this, Warchief?
Yeah, so the ramifications is like, on the long term, they're going to have to make gradual shifts and changes towards a different kind of economic model. The model that they've been using for the past 20, 30 years or more has been basically a manufacturing powerhouse with the cheapest labor to offer the global market. And that's why so much manufacturing, especially from the United States, flooded into China and to access that labor market. And that, of course, made them very wealthy. It created China's boom, and, the PRC has used those funds in every way possible to not only strengthen their regime, but also their forward thinking and knowing that they're going to have this demographic issue because of the child family policies. They knew that they had to get set up for that future. So what does that future look like? Essentially, they're going to be going down from over 1 billion people to well under 1 billion to around 600 million, maybe less. Because another factor I would throw in there is China, advancing in its status as a nation, has also had the same issues that any other nation has with, a culture that's becoming more modern and the plagues of modernity. So you also have women not having as many children or not having children at all because they're, prioritizing their career more or what have you, right? So it's probably going to be around 600 million or so. By the way, it's still tremendously more than the United States will be in the same time frame, okay? Unless we just import everybody around the world, which it seems like what we're doing, but I digress. So one of the ways that the PRC has done or is pushing to move, and what do you need to do when your demographics are moving like that, where you have less young people and you're going to have not as robust of a middle class, things of this nature. What you need to do is you need to leverage your financials, your financing, your purchasing power, and then your trade agreements, meaning the trade that you have established right now, all these different relationships with these countries, you need to kind of leverage them and move them to a different model where you're not making the stuff anymore, but you've gotten enough of a population to become and enough of a financial stability to be consumer-led. So what that means is they need to advertise to other nations that they have a very stable culture, they have a very stable, healthy culture in the sense of law, legal disputes. How do they when they trade with another country, and I'm now the country that's making the stuff. China is basically coming and saying, hey, we're going to buy it now instead of being a competitor to you like we used to be. So we want you to make the stuff, and then our country is going to be purchasing it. Well, that other nation needs to know that if there's a financial problem, if there's a dispute or a trade problem, that they're going to be able to work with the Chinese government and resolve that problem. So other nation, if you're a consumer-led nation, you need to show them that you have the money to purchase and that that money is going to be worth something for you, meaning you now have to exchange your, let's say, how can I make this more clear? Let's say you have Indonesia, or one of the nations in South China. They're now, let's say they have a better population with more younger people. They're now going to be building, all this stuff that China used to build, right, or a portion of it. Well, if I'm Indonesia and I'm building all these widgets and mid-grade or low-grade manufactured goods, I want to sell it to somebody who's going to help my purchasing power in the global economy the most. So is that a U.S. dollar? Is the U.S. dollar going to be what's going to give me the biggest purchasing power after I sell my stuff to them? Or is it going to be the Chinese yen, right? So how China and U.S., persuades those countries, okay, is that, hey, our demographic can buy more of your stuff, the volume, okay, and my dollar, my Chinese yen or U.S. dollar, gives you greater purchasing power in the global economy, okay, and my country is stable, it's healthy, there isn't any, strife, there isn't any uprisings or anything like that. If disputes happen between your companies and my companies, we have courts and things like that where these disputes are handled and handled fairly, right? So Indonesia needs to know that I'm going to, in the firms that are going to be making these manufactured goods, need to know that, who they're dealing with, it's going to be fair treatment, right? That's the consumer-led model, basically, in a nutshell, is that a nation making the goods and then selling the goods back to this consumer-led nation get all kinds of different perks, predominantly in, purchasing power and from the currency exchange that takes place, okay? So in China, in order to move there, they have to leverage all the trade relationships that they have with all these countries to the best of their ability and show them that they're going to be a fair partner, that they're going to get a lot of purchasing power from that Chinese yen, okay, and as well as other perks. For example, the United States, one of the big perks that we would leverage is that we have this great big U.S. Navy that can patrol your seas and help you with your security. Well, the PRC is doing exactly what the United States has done over the same years. It's transitioning to a consumer-led economy. It's going out there and building new trade agreements, hence the Belt and Road Initiative, where they've been investing in all these Central Asian countries, South Asian countries, African countries, the Middle East, building all kinds of trade relationships, building infrastructure. And then what else have they been doing? They've been building one of the world's largest navies. China is the world leader in shipbuilding and ship tonnage. And they're building one of the largest navies. And so they're basically copycatting the same kind of model, but just, with their spin on it, obviously. And that is, they go to countries and say, hey, you're going to make the goods, the manufactured goods, we consume them, okay? In exchange, you get purchasing power of your Chinese yen, and further, further perks would be, infrastructure investments in your nation and, military security of your area. So that means, we're going to build a little drone base in your country. That's exactly what we've done. We've gone around all over the world, building bases, building security contingent forces throughout the nation, patrolling people's seas, sending them money to build infrastructure. The only difference between China is that when they build infrastructure in another nation, they actually send Chinese folks and go and build that infrastructure, whereas the United States was more like high-paid contractors that go and guide or only do the most intensive labor and then rely on the local populace to do the rest. So
from what I understand,
that's kind of
too,
what's been happening.
From what I understand, too, that there are no, like, strings attached like the United States has dealing with, like, for instance, women's rights or, like, basically politically correct stuff. Like, the Chinese just go in with a raw economic deal while the United States hinges it on, moral failings or something like that. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. Again, I still to this day don't even understand, we would have to go on a whole other podcast about why we push this degeneracy and spread of this Western democracy with all the extra garbage that comes with it, gay, trans rights, sodomy, all these things, women's rights, all these things that are basically going to underpin and undermine and subvert that culture that you're trying to, of that nation that you're trying to partner with. Whereas, China isn't doing that. So really, when it comes to the U.S. and China, a lot of countries right now in the world, I would say that they are looking at U.S. and China, and if let's say you're a third-rate nation, you're a nation of the third world, right? When you look at the U.S., there's a little bit more trust there simply because it's the devil you know. I know what the U.S. does. I know what their modus operandi is. I know what they're going to, I know what they do. I know what they're about. I'm familiar. I'm more from the world. The global economy is more familiar with how the U.S. conducts business because that's been us this whole over 80 years now. Essentially, it's been us, right? And then I would say almost 40 years or more of that was solely us, meaning not even a close competitor at all. And so a lot of people, it's kind of like the devil I know, right? Whereas China is the new devil on the block. I don't know how they're going to behave. I don't have a long-term, record that I can access and be like, this is how they're going to respond in this situation. So China is the new kid on the block. They're not very proven. They don't have they don't have a record backing them, right? So a lot of third world countries or other countries, they're kind of on the fence, right? They might be on the fence. They might be like, I don't like that U.S. pushes this garbage on me and comes with all these strings attached. But I don't know how the Chinese are going to deal. I don't have a lot of trust there. I don't know what that long-term relationship is going to look like. Not only that, do I really know if they're going to be able to pull it off. The military is unproven, right? That's probably a big factor, right? So, not sure how it's going to play out. I mean, it seems like my idea, this is totally I'm not, this is just a thought that I have. This isn't something that Zeihan had said. But kind of going to your comment at the beginning of the, at the introduction about how it seems like that China is stepping up a lot stronger to aid Russia, not just economically, but maybe even militarily. I think what's happening is possibly, I'm not sure, this may be coming totally out of left field, but I think one way is China, they have an unproven military. They might sell themselves and say, our military is unproven, but, we have Russia military ally as well, and we have agreements with them, and you can access their security forces, and they can have a contingent of forces at your country if you think that is better. They're our buddies, and so part of me thinks that a lot of people are seeing China, we're looking at China and we're just looking at them alone, when it's really not them alone. Russia and China are sometimes it feels like they are working in tandem, and where Russia provides the high-end military technology as well as military, much more trained military forces, and the raw energy and from their oil reserves, raw mineral reserves, and then of course their food. And then China provides the finances, money, other technology suites like AI suites, and then of course this massive labor pool that it's going to shrink over time, but they still have it for now, right? So they still have a lot of production capacity, and then of course over time a consumer-led nation that will leverage their their financial ability and purchasing ability even higher, which will become more attractive to the third world. So it's more of like Russia and China are kind of like moving together, so to speak. And if China really, the rumors of them possibly stepping up and offering military aid, weapons and stuff like that for Russia in the Ukraine conflict, that's going to be a big signal that maybe what I'm saying is true. That their approach is going to be like, hey, we're not only are we stable and we offer these things as a standalone nation of China, but our big partner, Russia, has our back, and that's military, that's oil, so that's even more stability and security. Whereas what about U.S., right? So this is why the U.S. is kind of like a even though these are the new kids on the block, this is the moment in history right now where are we going to step up to the plate and the Western forces, particularly the Atlantic forces, step up to the plate and kind of show that we still got it, or is this where we see a fall in the West, right? Because like I said, even with Russia kind of this Russia-China combination, they're still kind of like the new kid on the block. It's still unproven. Although I would say, based on our previous podcast, Russia is certainly proving their military capability right now. They're showing that they can handle asymmetric forces, with what they accomplished in Syria. Okay, that was kind of like stage one, advertising to the world, oh yeah, we can handle an asymmetric war or insurgent forces just like the U.S. Can. And that's what they basically accomplished in Syria. And now they're showing on the world stage, oh, and by the way, we can also handle near-peer conventional forces. Which, to be honest with you, we didn't even accomplish that. We always fought forces that were significantly weaker than us, right?
Right. And I would like to just comment on that. So, like, a lot of people don't understand that barring Desert Storm, there haven't been large-scale operations against a near-peer adversary in the world since basically World War II. Obviously, some people would point to the Israeli wars against the Arabs, but again, that's also the Arabs, for whatever reason, are very incompetent at war, so really doesn't have the same kind of connotations as far as military operations. But it is important to go back and talk about this, because here's the thing is, people are like, alright, Russia is not getting that 3-day victory like they were supposed to have said, which is not true at all. But obviously they're running into trouble. Why? It's because they're arrayed against the entirety of NATO. And if they're still able to gain ground as they are right now, that means that NATO is arrayed against an enemy, a near-peer adversary that is capable. And it's been standing on its own 2 feet, economically and militarily as well, with only sourcing munitions from North Korea only recently, and I guess now they're talking to the PRC. But you have to remember that Russia has the economy the size of Italy, right? And so what does that mean necessarily for us? It means that we vastly underestimated Russia, and we vastly trained NATO countries. So, I mean, I have personally experienced with like liaisoning to those countries in a way, and I would say that, like, apart from the French military, NATO is not a capable military force. In fact, it's basically just a collective security group, which falls under the American umbrella of protection. So, for instance, you take the Libyan intervention. They said it was a multi-level NATO coalition, but everything was provided for to NATO by the United States. Whether it's the carrier strike group, whether it's the logistical end of things, whether it's the munitions themselves or the smart integration, which you put onto dumb bombs, we're the ones that were providing that. Roughly speaking, the Europeans don't have that. And so now the Europeans are in a oh shit moment, right? And then they're getting all their stuff ground down in Ukraine. And people are like, well, why are we doing that when China is already threatening Taiwan, and we might have to conserve our munitions, our hardware, instead of sending it to Ukraine to help defend Taiwan, which is a far more important and strategic economic asset than Ukraine ever was. But you go ahead and comment.
Yeah, so before I comment on... I'll just make a quick comment on what you're saying here. It absolutely agree with what you're saying. This is really the moment, okay? I mean, I think forces in Europe kind of already saw this, and I believe France's military power, and then Germany's technological power, right? I think they wanted to join forces. And be kind of like, and reconstitute the Eurozone, right? But maybe relations between France and Germany kind of soured, and then that's when Russia, as you know, was very much trying to join into the Eurozone, and they were convincing the Germans, because they're like, hey, Germany, with your high technology, we purchase your rocket technology, we purchase a lot of your technology that aids our military technology, and you rely on all of our gas and oil through all these pipelines. Why don't you let us join the Eurozone? And Germany, I believe, was entertaining that idea. But whatever, I think we put pressure on and basically severed that, and also put pressure on France. Because maybe France was on the fence. Maybe they're like, well, we want to be the guys that lead the Eurozone, not us and Russia, right? So the Eurozone is kind of fractured, but then this conflict is really showing that their instincts were correct, that, hey, the U.S. isn't that guy anymore. And we're certainly way behind on everything. That's it's like a massive wake-up call to, and solidifying maybe a lot of the intuition and thinking that was going on in the Eurozone, right? And of course, again, Russia standalone, fighting a massive conventional war against a near-peer adversaries, and then of course against all of NATO, at least on a logistical standpoint, economic standpoint, and they're able to hold their own. They're only just now getting allies coming in, and in my opinion, that would be leveling the playing field. If China gave more support to Russia via weapons and stuff like that, that essentially would be leveling the playing field, because that's what we've been doing with Ukraine's forces, right? So it would actually be technically an even fight, which of course our propaganda isn't going to say that, right? And that's one front, right? If China, as you correctly say, if they attack Taiwan, and now we have another front here, okay? That means we have to now have, our logistics are now going to be split between two very weak forces. NATO is weak without us. Obviously, the Asian countries. I mean, Japan's pretty strong. So we'll have to see how hard Japan would step up to the plate, because their Navy forces, I think, the third largest in the world. They're actually pretty significant. But let's just say you have two fronts, and both of your allies are kind of weak, meaning you're doing 80% of the lifting on both fronts, whereas with Russia and China, Russia's doing 80% of the lifting on the Ukraine side, so they only need, let's say, 20% help from their allied forces. And then China would be doing 80% of the lifting on the Eastern Front with maybe only 20% help from other allies. So do you see what I'm saying? It's already kind of like, if this conflict in Ukraine does erupt into World War III, we're really going to be I mean, it will really going to be put on the pressure here, and I'm not sure what that outcome would look like. There's obviously, that's a whole nother discussion. So, kind of getting back to, yeah, go ahead.
So, actually, I mean, from my experience, just talking to, when I was in the military and stuff, and the fixation even back all the way down to 2010, 2009, was that China was on the rise, and it was a significant and critical threat. And now it's gotten to the point where it's shifted from interdicting Chinese capability from advancing technologically or logistically, politically, etc., to all the way to, okay, the coming war is coming now, like soon, like maybe next year, maybe, like that's for real. And on top of that, we have the added issue of, okay, we're not going to win this outright. What we can do is maybe incur a Pyrrhic victory on the Chinese. That's a significant difference in rhetoric as opposed to what it used to be, which is, we're gonna smash them, no problem. They have this weird, outdated force like the Russians. The Russians are totally, unprepared. But now the circumstances have so completely changed in the favor of the CSTO, which is what their alliance is called, and especially with the addition of Iran into this conflict, which will put significant tensions on OPEC nations and our capability of getting sustainable and cheap oil to provide for not just logistically for our people, consumer goods and economy, which by the way, we're going into a severe recession right now, but also the ability to provide for our militaries that petrol that we need, especially because our tank force, people don't know this, but the reason why the Russians use the T-72s as opposed to their more modern T-14 or T-90 armadas is because diesel engines are far more cost-effective and gas-efficient than their gas turbine engines of the later models. And our entire tank fleet of Abrams runs on gas turbine engines, which are gas guzzlers. And so that's a significant strategic calculus that we have to think about, because both Iran and Russia are huge producers of oil. And that's something that the Chinese only need, which they won't face the same predicament as the Japanese in World War II, who had no exposure to oil. Now we have a menace the size of a gargantuan titan, now with unlimited supply of oil for their military forces. But you go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, again, significant challenges. And let's kind of go back to, we'll circle back on that, but let's go back to demographic situation. So, as I said, that's kind of the model that they're moving towards, is they're going to be consumer-led. They need to convince the third world that dealing with China is easier dealing and fair dealing than dealing with the West, and that our military power is just as good or even better, especially if they prove so in the coming military conflict directly with the West, if not already. And other aspects here is, that population, if I'm a consumer-led here and a consumer-led there, at the end of the day, a lot of firms, yes, all the perks and the purchasing power by converting my currency when these exchanges of my goods to your market take place, that's an important factor. But another important factor is just volume. So if their populace decreases to 600 million or whatever, it's double what we are now, and would still be over 200 million more than what the U.S. happens. So if you're producing low-quality manufactured goods, you're still going to go with volume. You may still go with who has the greater volume in the market, right? And then, of course, Zeihan says that, they're going to have a famine, and all of them are going to die, if we put the sanctions on them that we did on Russia. I absolutely agree that, when if this conflict occurs and we put sanctions on China, it's going to very, very harm them. I mentioned earlier that they've built a lot of agreements with a lot of nations. Obviously, Iran and Russia are very strong agreements, North Korea, but The Belt and Road Initiative is not as successful as they would have liked it to have been. And that's not even counting the interference that we made in Central Asia and things like that. So their economy still dramatically and overwhelmingly is based on trade relations with us, the U.S. So it's going to hurt them significantly, and that makes me wonder, maybe that was the purpose behind the lockdowns and why they did them for so long with COVID. I'm kind of suspicious about COVID in general, and I kind of look at the lockdowns as maybe this was their way of seeing how long they can keep their populace in line. They wanted to see what the breaking point was, and it was over 2 years, right, that their populace just followed orders and stayed inside and didn't consume much, right, which probably led a surplus in their supply chain because nobody was consuming anything, right? So it was almost like war preparation, if you think about it. Where I was going with that. So when they get hit with those sanctions, they kind of have an idea of how the populace will react, whether they're going to be able to, whether things are going to get so bad that they're going to have huge domestic issues, right? And I'm not saying a famine would happen. I'm not exactly sure. These kinds of extreme things can happen with China. There is a record, or historical record behind that. But I don't know. I think things are different now, and you'd be surprised how quickly a populace can get behind their government when there's a clear enemy. That, we're getting sanctioned by the U.S. That's why our economy is going to crap, and now we're involved in a direct war with the U.S. Okay, well, the populace just gets in line, right? Whereas our country, we haven't even been in a global conflict since World War II, and this conflict is certainly going to be more intense, I would say, than that one, or just as intense. And I'm not totally sure how the United States is going to react as a populace. We're very divided, so it's going to be very interesting. But he is correct, Zeihan, that sanctions would very much harm them. And I love how when he talks about that, he essentially says, the policies that Trump put in place, these new trade agreements, and basically telling technological firms that, hey, if you want to keep doing business in China, you're going to face problems with, we're not going to allow that anymore. So you need to move your highest grade technological assets, including especially personnel, out of China, and you need to move them back to the United States. And it's funny how, Trump got criticized constantly, berated constantly, and then he puts this nationalist policy in that's basically anti-China, and Biden is now solidifying it, expanding it, crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's. And it's just funny how, Zeihan takes all these stabs at the right wing, yet here he is acknowledging, that even the Biden regime acknowledging that this trade policy was the correct policy, right? That a nationalist policy, so we're going to see more nationalism no matter what here in the United States, because that's the only way you can respond to what they're doing, right? The global order and the global system is collapsing as we speak. And that system was 100% U.S. hegemony, right? So I just wanted to mention that, and, let's see, I'm kind of lost in thought here.
No, but I would actually like to add something here, if you don't mind.
Yes, go ahead.
So, I was just hearing about this. I was reading the Bloomberg freaking newspaper, and it talked about almost, instead of being in denial, remember that at first they said it was a pipe dream, right, with Brexit, that, great power politics, globalism was inevitable. Remember that? It was inevitable. Yeah. You can't get around it. And then it started being, well, now nationalists are threatening it, maybe, and then it became, we must fortify democracy and globalism. And then to today, I remember reading an article, and especially in The Economist as well, that globalism is over. That era is over. The 1990s is over. And so it's really, obviously they're the enemy. They don't want to admit defeat, but it's important for our viewership to understand that what you do in this life matters, and it has an effect, and we were able to take a significant threat at least down a peg. You know what I mean? And I mean, I don't know if you know this, but I read that in The Economist. I was surprised, and The Economist is a huge shill for globalism.
Oh yeah. That's a huge, I would call that a flare, a signal flare. Usually The Economist is kind of, sometimes they throw ideas out there from the technological elite of the West, and especially the money powers and the banks. So, and sometimes they're sending a signal flare of being like, hey, just so you guys know, like, time's up on different issues. So I did not know that. That's I would say that's significant. And I don't think so. Kind of going back to if we sanction them, these different trade policies that we're rapidly putting into place, it's trying to stave off and brain drain, well, economically drain, but also brain drain, particularly and technologically drain China, right? Because obviously, if they're going to become a major world power or the world power, technology is going to be, you got to be on the forefront of that. You got to be the pioneer of that. And then, of course, in technological warfare, you need to have that edge, right? And clearly, they definitely have an edge. I would say in 3 categories already. They're definitely kind of leading an edge in, or at least catching up to our edge in AI technology. And if you think about it, they've employed AI technologies on a wider scale than Western powers, with their whole social credit system that they have there, that nightmare system that I'm sure our technological elite here would love to have. Okay, so don't get mixed up about it at all. Our technological elite would love. In fact, I feel like they're jealous of what China has accomplished. And I'm pretty sure, what's that guy, Charles Schwab from the World Economic Forum, he even said as much when he did an interview with a Chinese news agency recently, where he said, I find so many great things about China. And, he was smirking and so giddy. I was surprised he didn't just slip up and say, we want to be just like you, like, it's just ridiculous. So keep that in mind, that, the oligarchy here in the West, is more of a rivalry. They all agree on that they want to accomplish the exact same things. This is just a rivalry, and we're caught in the middle. So just think about that. So when talking about this brain drain and the technological drain, I just kind of want to put a little bit more detail there, because people need to understand. So let's when it comes to technology, I mentioned the AI. Another 2 key places would be military technologies, such as hypersonic missiles and drones. Okay, we're definitely the leader in drones, but I would say China has put lots of emphasis into drones and are catching up, if not surpassing. And then, of course, hypersonic missiles, we're behind them and Russia. But let's just talk about, this. So military technology, you can easily argue is, when you want to measure a country's technological output and ability, is, looking and emphasizing their military technology. Because obviously military technology and all the R&D that goes behind it usually trickles out into your commercial forces and becomes commercial available technology, right? Civilian. So when you look at that, a lot of people tend to boil down, well, we've been the leader in military technology, we spend the most money on military technology, there's no way China is catching up, blah, 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 blah. You see this a lot, and it's because the average person doesn't really understand how military spending works. And they also don't understand the proper way to compare spending in one country versus another, right? How do you compare Russian military spending when, as you said earlier, their economy is only the size of Italy, and our economy is the largest in the world? How do you even make that comparison? Well, it's purchasing power parity, right? What that essentially means is if we were having equal footing, if that purchasing power was equal footing, how many units of labor, how many units of hardware am I getting per spend, right? Per dollar spent, right? Essentially what purchasing power parity is doing. You know, it's helping us trying to compare apples to apples as opposed to world's largest economy to economy only size Italy, right? And what happens when you equate for that purchasing power, that's when you really see what's their results. So, for example, Russia, they just don't have the production capacity. And that's why, you know, take, for example, their Su-57, which is, you know, their most advanced fighter jet, right? They're only able to make such small, limited quantities. And then by the time they even get a few of those quantities or squadrons produced, they're already on to them. They already have to be pushed to the next project or the next gen to keep up with the rest of the world. Even by the time they roll out that unit, right? So when you look at Russia, it's like, okay, they have a lot of the other pieces of the equation accounted for, you know, the energy input, the R&D input, but they're just really hindered on production capacity because they just have a shorter. They already had their demographic collapse, right? For the most part, so you know they have a production capacity problem, whereas we have a greater production capacity, so we trump them, right? Even if we spent the same amount of dollars, right? Well, when you look at China, okay, that purchasing power parity and what they're getting out of it starts to have them catch up significantly to where we spend. I think we spend like what, $800 billion or something like that, or maybe $700 billion. And you know, on paper, China looks like it's only spending like 5, 6, or something like that. It's much higher. It's much closer when you start factoring in this purchasing power parity. And how to make sense of that real quick is, you know, I mentioned the Su-57. That's the highest grade fighter jet. That would be like building a F-35 or an F-22 in the United States. And that we've built hundreds of F-35s, you know, many squadrons, whereas they've only been able to build maybe a handful of squadrons, right? Well, in China, their equivalent would be the J-20, right, fighter aircraft. And they're building it close to the production capacities that we have for our F-35. So what I'm trying to say here is, remember I mentioned earlier that they're already the world's leader in shipping tonnage, and their Navy has just exploded. The amount of submarines they have, the amount of battle cruisers they have, is just accelerating. Usually people, they only concentrate on the aircraft carrier, but they don't really understand that, you know, the aircraft carrier isn't necessary. If I were to engage the United States right now on the oceans, I wouldn't necessarily need an aircraft carrier or dozens of them. I would need more drones. I would need lots of cruisers that can engage you with ship-to-ship missiles from long distances. And then I can have my J-20 fleet launch from different islands or bases. And the J-20 is designed and oriented for long-range engagements, including their missiles, right? For example, you know, they have the I think it's called the PL-15 missile, and that's a much longer range missile than what we can produce right now with the AIM-9X, and even right now I think we're trying to produce something called the AIM 60X or something like that, where we're trying to catch up to that missile technology that China has in long range. So you can't look at China and be like, oh, they only have one aircraft carrier. We have, you know, dozens. So that's not how you want to measure it. You want to measure it in the total tonnage of their fleet, submarines, cruisers, all the other craft. And they are huge, man. And they've just been building and building nonstop. They just keep building, okay? And if we, in modern conflict, as we see in Ukraine, and I'm sure the same would be true in a naval conflict, is essentially it's going to be attrition, right? So if I take out like dozens of your fleet aircraft and you can't reproduce and that tonnage and reproduce it and recoup those losses, whereas China can just spit these things out, you know, that says a lot, right? So to kind of put this in perspective, the position that the U.S. and China in right now, when we look at military spending, we are basically Germany of World War II, and China is the U.S. of World War II. And what I mean by that is the majority of our spending is spent on high paid, salaries, wages, and benefits of our professional military force, and all the grifting that goes along with it at the DoD, right? And then the next phase of that is we blow a lot of money on maintenance on all this old equipment that we have, okay? And just keeping that equipment going. And like you mentioned earlier, a lot of our equipment is based on the old global order. So, for example, our M1 Abrams are extremely expensive logistically because they use gas and not diesel, right? That's a micro example, right, of what I'm talking about here. And then when it does come to new technologies, we have all this bloat, and we blow all these technologies or monies on these wonder weapons, just like Germany did. And yeah, these wonder weapons are going to be, really advanced, really high, like really good, but like if you can't produce them in mass, right? You have this crazy German tank that's super strong, powerful. It's superior to all the other tanks, but I'm overwhelming your tank battalion with like twice the size with all these little Shermans flying around. It don't matter how good the tank is; it's going to get overwhelmed.
Exactly. And just to add to the point, just a technical point, the thing that people don't understand is that to calculate, so to speak, military force, mass is your base value. The technology and munitions and all that kind of stuff, that's a force multiplier. That is not the base of what like military power is. You need mass. Mass is the origin, and that's what they have in spades. And just to add another point before you continue, yeah, they have one aircraft carrier, but that's not their strategy. They don't need multiple aircraft carriers. They don't need like a global, navy. What they need is a strong green water navy that can project their power off their shores, keep America off, from invading their mainland, and more importantly, project their power along a trade route that's hugged closely to the coast. That's all that matters, and that's why they're focused on that. But go ahead.
Yeah, and so what you have is you have a military force that has bloat when it comes to spending and management in headcount. You have bloat in maintenance costs, and then you're sitting here chasing these red herons and these wonder weapons, and not having that production capacity and not having that volume, which, as you said, matters the most. China, exactly the opposite. They don't have a bloat in their pay because they don't pay these guys well. They don't have bloat in maintenance costs because their military is pretty much brand new. It's like some of these craft are like less than a couple years old, so they don't have any bloat in maintenance. They did have bloat in the beginning in upgrading, in the sense that the Chinese populace, now that they've been able to actually like eat full meals 3 times a day, they've gotten big. They've gotten like tall. So some of them don't even fit in the uniforms. Some of them don't even fit in the armored, their armored vehicles. So they had to initially spend a lot of money just getting these things so that people can fit in them and use them, which is ridiculous, which is crazy when you think about it. But that's done now. So they don't have bloat in pay and headcount. They don't have bloat in maintenance. So where's all their money going to? All their money is going to sheer capacity of numbers, production, and then it's going into new technologies, R&D. So remember, if I'm the U.S. and I'm trying to keep a technological edge, but all my money most of my money got absorbed into just paying people and maintenance costs, okay, and all these bases we have all over the world. I have a small amount of money now going towards to keep that technological edge going. If you're China and you have a huge surplus of money to dump into R&D, you're going to catch up very quickly, okay? And I think they have. Now, I think they're still lacking in key technologies, like rocket engines, for example. And I still think their military is very much unproven. But we're going to see how...
It's turbine engines.
Yeah.
They're actually very advanced in rocket solid fuel engines. So, sorry, go ahead. I don't want to interrupt.
Okay. But again, this is very similar to Germany of World War II and U.S. of World War II. Our military was kind of pretty much unproven. We were lacking in a lot of equipment and technologies, but we just absorbed those casualties. We just absorbed all of that. We were just a juggernaut that couldn't be stopped, right? And of course, me and you know more detail about World War II, and that we weren't facing the strongest of German forces. The strongest German units were deployed on the Eastern Front, but still, right? If a conflict were to happen today, U.S. is the Germany of World War II, and China is the U.S. of World War II. And we saw what happened. We saw how that went down. So I feel right now, how would it play any differently? There's a phrase, there's a saying in military thought, and that is, in World War III, high technological conventional warfare, the first casualty of high technology is high technology. Meaning, I have a J-20 aircraft that flies up, shoots missiles from long, beyond visual range, all that, stealthily. It hits a whole bunch of my units because I couldn't detect them, couldn't intercept in time. I have an F-35 that goes, flies out there, doesn't get detected, shoots a bunch of missiles, hits a bunch of Chinese targets that they couldn't detect, they couldn't intercept, right? So I took losses, they took losses, right? They kind of counter each other, right? So at that point, it's going to come down to, as you said, the attrition rates, right? And remember, if I do detect that F-35 and shoot it down, how hard is it for me to reproduce it and replace it? Versus if I detected that J-20 and shot it down, how quickly they're going to be able to reproduce it and put a new one back up in the sky, including a pilot. So, I don't think people really understand a technological edge, as you said, is not the key point. And when you get down to these details that I just talked about, they're actually way closer than we thought. So it's not like, high technology isn't the key, but China is so far behind that they're not far behind. They're right next door. They're right on par with a lot of our technologies. Okay, particularly drones, hypersonic missiles, especially land to ship missiles, surface missiles. They've had that game locked down for a long time, right? Because they have missile batteries scattered across their entire large coast, and that would just flood the battle space with these long-range missiles, right? So, kind of going on, to just kind of giving, another thing he said was like, they don't have enough young people to go consumer-led. I don't think that matters as much, Chinese culture is very different. The elderly work. Our elderly, by the way, have continued to work, but I would argue that, the elderly in China have probably worked longer and more into their elderly years than the elderly here, right? So the idea that they can't go consumer-led, I don't really agree with when he says that. I think he says it at like the 30-minute mark. I think they can easily go consumer-led, okay? You have countries that went consumer-led with a fraction of the size of the population that China has. So this idea that they're going to have this demographic collapse, and just from that sheer demographic collapse, they can't go consumer-led, that's ridiculous. And as we talked about many times, you can easily rebound your birth rates very quickly, which, look what happened at the end of World War II. We had a massive baby boom. Why? Because we were the victors. We won. We were now the global hegemony. So if China and Russia take this gambit and win, they're going to have massive baby booms, right? And then, so this whole idea, one moment Zeihan could be saying, in 10 years they're basically going to be gone. I mean, I think he even said that at one point. Yeah, I think he even said like, in 10 years they're not going to be around. And he said that about Russia too, like, they only have like 10, 15 years left or something like that. Just ridiculous comments, right? When, how much you want to bet, if they won, next he'll be doing a podcast or a YouTube video where he's like, oh my God, their birth rates are going to be huge. They're going to have double the size. Like, it can be reversed very quickly, within a generation, basically. We talked about how, I want to emphasize to, in this podcast that when you look at China and you look at how they're progressing, they're really following the playbook of the United States. I always feel like history's repeating. It's just you're reswapping Germany out and the Axis powers for the United States and the handful of Atlantic powers that we have, like Britain and like the UK and France, versus Russia and China, right? Which would be Russia and the U.S. of the Allied forces in World War II. And I just feel like history's repeating. It's just when you get into these details, what did China do? They in the 1980s they opened up their economy and they went to being the greatest manufacturer base of the world. That's what we were in the 1930s and into the 1940s. Okay, we were the world's largest manufacturing base. Okay, and you had cheap labor where we were producing everybody's goods. Okay, and then they made their money from that, and then they started they're slowly transitioning. They took that money and spent it on building up their military, building up more trade agreements with people, furthering their alliance with Russia, and then they're moving. They now know that they got to move into consumer-led. In order to do that, you're going to have to be able to convince people that your dollar is a better option than the U.S. dollar. Well, what better way to prove that to people than by challenging the U.S. directly? And it's going to be, that involves military. So
I wanted to ask you a question.
Yeah,
I wanted to ask you a question. So, from what I understand, you're very knowledgeable about currencies and current market spending. Could you explain to us what exactly currencies are hinged on and why the yen might be superior to the dollar?
Well, right now, okay, so there's a lot to unpack there. So this goes back to Bretton Woods agreements of the end of World War II. So at the end of World War II, the Allied forces, basically got together and decided how they were going to chop up the world, right? How they're going to divide the world up amongst the Allied powers, particularly the U.S., Britain, and Russia. And of course, Stalin is when, and they initially wanted they kind of were pushing for a global government, kind of. And they wanted to, the UN was created. Different organizations were created for starting to push this world into a global economy. Stalin wasn't cooperating, and that's what kind of led us into the Cold War, because he kind of wanted to do his own thing, and he didn't want to cooperate with what the banking elite and technological elite of the West wanted to do. So they just kind of divided the world and went forward. And there's a lot to unpack there, but I'm just skipping over that for now. And so, eventually, the global system at that time, you had the U.S. dollar was the world reserve currency. And so what that means is, how can I remember I showed you a long time ago, I drew like a diagram. It's hard to explain this architecture without like a diagram to look at, without an illustration, because it's just going to sound very confusing. But what I'm going to try and illustrate here is this. You have the world hegemony power, the U.S. You have a sort of adjacent organization, what's called at the UN, World Bank, IMF. The IMF stands for International Monetary Fund. So you have the U.S. and these adjacent organizations. They want to facilitate a global trade, right? Globalism. What you do is you divide the world into two pieces. You have the third world, where they only provide very cheap raw material. So that would be energy, oil, and that would be all your other raw goods. Okay, metals, all that stuff. Okay. The other half of the world is they take that raw material, cheap energy, cheap raw material inputs, and they output really quality, low quality to mid-tier quality to high quality goods. Okay, so for example, we had two direct allies right at the end, right at the immediate end of World War II, or essentially two countries that we conquered. I mean, let's just be frank, and that was Germany and Japan. Well, in order to get Germany and Japan that were completely decimated and destroyed and bombed into oblivion, how do you get them from that to a sprawling, powerful or healthy economy and country? Well, what they did was they essentially took raw material from the third world, you bring it in to the second world, right? Who then take that raw material and they make those manufactured goods, and then they dump those manufactured goods into the first world, or the one world power, which would be the U.S., because we're the consumer now, we're consuming it. In order to facilitate this relationship, you have the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency. Now, the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency, it needs to be stronger, like valued more than the third world, so that when they sell their goods or their raw materials, their energy and their raw materials, they're getting U.S. dollars for it, and those U.S. dollars are worth much higher than their local currencies or any of the currencies of the third world, so that they can then use those dollars to purchase, again, high technologies. They can purchase those manufactured goods from the second world. They can use those dollars to invest in their economy, or in most cases, when it comes to the third world, it'll just line the pockets of some dictator, line the pockets of some faction and their cronies, right? Let's just be real, right? The second world, what they do is their currency, their local currencies have to be higher or more valuable than the U.S. reserve currency. Because if it's lower than the U.S. reserve currency, then it's too costly for them to offload those manufactured goods into the U.S. market, right? So it needs to be valued higher than the U.S. currency, okay? Not too much higher, but higher. Because what they're doing is they're taking their currency, which is valued higher, exchanging it for U.S. dollars, and then using those U.S. dollars to purchase those cheap energy and raw materials into their country to make their manufactured goods, and then offshore it back to U.S. and make that money back again. So that's kind of the relationship that's been going on for almost 80 years. There was a hiccup, okay? There was a hiccup in the 70s. That hiccup was basically a faction of third world nations that were major oil producers, got together, formed a cartel known as OPEC, okay, that was led by Saudi Arabia, and said, hey, we're not just going to be, our oil isn't just going to be taken without any additional perks, right? So they showed us that they had that their cartel had enough power to do damage to the U.S. economy, and in retrospect, our allies in the second world, and in particularly Europe, Japan. And we had the oil crisis of the 1970s. And how did we resolve that crisis? We basically said, okay, all oil that the OPEC sells has to be done, we had to get off the gold standard to facilitate this. We kind of already were, but it was truly the last sort of pegs to the U.S. reserve currency to gold was severed in the 1970s during this crisis. And that was done in order to create the volume in dollars needed to facilitate the new agreement, which was basically all oil needs to be sold, especially from OPEC nations, needs to be sold in U.S. dollars, okay? And in exchange, the agreement we made to Saudi Arabia, since they were the guys that were pretty much leading this cartel, was that we would have U.S. bases in their country, and we're going to provide total security from their adversaries or rivals, particularly Iran, Iraq, other Middle East nations that don't like Saudi Arabia, or there's historic beef between the two, and definitely cultural religious issues, Shiite versus Sunni, and there's a lot more to unpack in that story. But that happened in the 1970s, right? Which created even greater purchasing power or leverage that the U.S. currency had, and it created the volume needed for the actual financial system for dollars to circulate, because there was no more, gold was no more kind of like limiting that. And it also forced a lot of third world nations that aren't part of OPEC to now, a lot of countries that did have oil benefited from selling those goods with a direct exchange. Well, now they have to exchange it to U.S. dollars, and OPEC now sets price. So this is what happened, right? And over the course of the past 80 years, these are major events that happened that continued to facilitate this arrangement. And remember, that arrangement was U.S. is consumer-led. We have the second world is, not necessarily under us, but they make the goods and then dump them in the U.S. market. That's why you had all these Japanese cars and all these Japanese goods dump into the U.S. market in the 80s and 90s. And then you had all these European goods dump into the U.S. market, right? And they benefit from that relationship. Now, in the beginning, our economy was so big and powerful, and our population was so robust, that in the beginning, domestic firms and corporations were able to absorb that excess manufactured goods being dumped into the market. We had such good internal economic health that it didn't hinder our firms too much. But over time, we basically had to destroy domestic competition in order to continue to facilitate, meaning you had to sacrifice a lot of domestic American corporations and firms, small guys, the small businesses, the mid-tier businesses. A lot of them had to get wiped out and sacrificed, and that led to more less U.S. jobs, right? In order to continue to facilitate this relationship between the second world firms who are producing all these manufactured goods and the third world who are producing the raw material and energy. And in the case of China, they stepped in and provided a second input, a major one, which was cheap labor, which also helped leverage the second world, Germany, Japan, and other nations, even better profits, because then they used that labor, right? Which, again, further harmed Americans domestically, okay? So that's kind of been the arrangement, right? And it's harder to say it. It's much easier to illustrate it into a kind of like a chart or a diagram. What China would be doing when I say that they are going to go to consumer-led, when they're trying to make the yen more attractive, what they're basically trying to do is they're just trying to replace the U.S. in that model that I just described with them. So if you think about it, China would be the consumer-led economy, where the yen is now the reserve currency, right? And the third world provides the cheap labor and cheap materials and cheap energy that then flows to the second world, right? Which would probably be, in this scenario, with China being the world hegemony, it would probably be Europe, and it would probably be the U.S. We would become Japan of the 1980s. We would become, Germany, right? We would become this nation that has a small population that does all these mid-grade to high-grade technological goods that then get sold and dumped into Chinese markets and Russian markets, right? And this would be okay with China because, again, their population is decreasing. They're not going to have this juggernaut of a manufacturing base anymore. It's going to be slowly shut down, and they're going to have this sort of, basically China's going to look like the U.S. of the 1990s, where you have this robust middle class that's just spending and spending and spending. And if you look at China, you can argue that they can really set this up really well, because let's say this all goes down, and they're now the world reserve currency, and they're now the world's consumer-led country, right? In order to get Chinese people to spend money and buy stuff, right? Because that's what in order to keep this model going, you need to keep your populace constantly consuming, right? Why do you think in America everyone just blows money on dumb shit all the time? Because we've just been brainwashed by corporations and by our government elite to do that, right? Because that's what maintains this globalist model. Well, China, they would be able to do it even easier. because they have a social credit system. They can easily flip a switch and say, hey, you didn't buy enough shit this month. Go spend money. Or you get rewarded, your social credit score goes higher when you consume, when you just go out and buy stuff. And if you understand Chinese culture, okay, these bugmen, they really are bugmen. They just go and they blow money on stuff. They blow money on crap. That's why you see them wearing stupid stuff like Supreme. You know, I mean, I could say the thing about like Air Jordans with American consumers, but you get what I'm trying to say here is that they can probably even make it work even more so than in the United States. You know, in the United States, we've had these ups and downs and recessions, and you know, some people just, you know, they can't afford to keep purchasing things. They can't keep that juice going, right? So, whereas in China, they might be able to keep it going in you know, because they have such a top-down management, such a technological dystopia over there with their social credit system, right? So I hope I'm making people kind of understand that they're trying to advertise to the third world and to the second world, particularly Europe, and probably the banking elite, probably all these wealthy elites throughout the world who don't see themselves tied to a single nation. You know, they just want to keep making their money and maintain their power. China could just advertise and say, look, we're just swapping in the place of U.S. Everybody's tired of the U.S. Everybody's tired of dealing with them. You know, we can be just like them. We positioned ourselves to be just like them. They followed our playbook, okay? In and out, they followed it, right? And more importantly, they can sell that, hey, you know, unlike the United States where the populace is split, you know, Democrat versus Republican, and you have to exhaust a lot of resources brainwashing them and propaganda, and, you know, I have to line the pockets of a Democrat to get what I want, or I have to line the pockets of a Republican to get what I want. In China, there ain't no Republican Democrat. It's just the PRC. And you deal with us, and we have a social credit system and a regime that has complete control over our populace. Do you see what I'm saying? To a
of course, yeah.
Elite, to the technological elite, that's a way more attractive sell. Which is why I won't be surprised at all if we have a conflict. The conflict is very short. We lose, and then our government just says, "Oh, hey guys, we're moving on. The world's, you know, we're moving on. China's in charge. We're moving on. Shut up. Stop complaining. We're moving on. Everything's going to be fine. You know." Eat the bugs, work in the manufacturing plant. Whereas now, it's eat the bugs, sit in your house and watch TV and buy shit. It's going to be eat the bugs and go to work and work 15 hours and then come home and don't complain about anything, right? So, you know, we could become, you know, the roles could get reversed where we now are the cheap ass labor, which makes me wonder why maybe that's why we are allowing so many illegal immigrants come into the country, because they're just going to be this workforce, this ant-bugman workforce that gets shoved into these manufacturing facilities that used to be in China that then get moved here, right? Now, again, I'm not exactly sure how these things can go. Maybe this conflict doesn't lead to a clear winner. It kind of leads to a new Cold War where we're the Soviet Russia of the Cold War, and China is the U.S. of the Cold War, and everybody allied or choosing to work with China benefits more from the financial system and the global system, and then anyone who decides to stay with the old guard or the USA, they don't benefit as much, but they're kind of, you know, they're able to do their own thing to a certain extent. But, you know, do you get what I'm saying? Like, you know, in the Cold War,
yeah.
people who chose to go with the Soviet Union, they weren't as wealthy. They didn't have as much money. They didn't have as much of the perks in the global system. But they had some security. They had some wealth, and they had some autonomy from the larger powers, right?
Well, I'm sure we're going to see.
I could see that going as well.
We're going to see what happened in the Middle East during the Cold War, which is countries playing one side over the other. You know what I mean? That's what the Third World did. And basically, and to reiterate, the First World is NATO and America-led. Second World was a Cold War terminology for the Comintern, which are the communist countries. And the Third World was the unaligned faction, which obviously became conflated with the idea that the Third World was the least economically developed. The second world was medium, and the first one was. But these are also true statements as well. But yeah, and I think I wanted to ask you, I think the most important question that's coming up in recent events. So, when do you think war would happen with China? And what do you think necessarily would be the outcome, most likely outcome? Obviously, you gave us some options, but what do you think would most likely happen?
Man, it's really hard to tell. We need to do a podcast to kind of discuss what the future is going to look like, because as much as we are talking, we're in this podcast and the previous podcast, we're kind of saying things are really in favor of Russia and China, right? And when you put all the data on the table, it does lean a little bit more towards the Russia and China being kind of succeeding, but you just don't know. Anything can happen, especially in war. Anything can happen. Who knows? Somehow, maybe the propaganda machine in the United States goes 100% in the other direction, becomes a super right wing, and blames China for everything. And the next thing you know, all the idiots here in the U.S. just sign up and go to war, and somehow we win. You never know. You never know what can happen. Right now, on all the data on the table, it seems like that wouldn't happen. It seems like China and Russia would win. Now, as far as China, when would that happen? Very hard to say. Because of how devastating the sanctions would be right now, if it was to happen right now or this year or even next year, it would be pretty devastating to China. It would be a pretty big shock to China. I do think the lockdowns was nothing more than a training exercise. With the social credit system, all the cameras, they're able to see and record in real time what the population was doing, who was resisting, who wasn't resisting, who was dealing with it, who wasn't. So that gives them an idea of what to prepare for, right? So to me, that tells you that they're very serious about a conflict. And I would say maybe 2025. There's been a couple of U.S. commanders who have kind of had some memos, internal memos to their forces that they're in command of, to say, hey, we need to step up our training. We're going to be doing more fierce training regiments because you guys are not upholding the standards that are needed. And reason why is because we're going to be going to war with China in 2025. So I might just float that out there. If you were to really pressure me into giving a time, I think 2025 makes sense. If you look at Russia, they basically, I think China attacking Taiwan will happen either just before U.S. elections in 2024, so that would be quarter 4 of 2024, or it's going to happen just after, so Q1, Q2, quarter 1, quarter 2 of 2025, because that's what it seems like with Russia, that they did it just before, or basically the beginning of Q1 of 2022, and then we had our elections in at the end of 2022. So it's going to either take place just before or just after. If you were to really pressure me into a time frame, if the time frame gets pushed out beyond 2025, that would show me that China really knows that they can't handle the sanctions and that they need more time for building up their forces. But if they, which gives us more time to disrupt that, to put doubt that China can actually pull it off, things like that. But I kind of feel, if you had to tell me right now, based on the information I have right now, based on the rhetoric, based on the recent events of them meeting with Russia, possibly stepping up and providing weapons, it could be much sooner than a lot of people think, like 2025. As far as them winning that conflict, that's going to be much harder to say. The Spratly Islands that they militarized, over the past few years, yes, it kind of pushed their defensive battery and their defensive envelope larger and extended it, but again, I don't see them lasting more than maybe the first couple of engagements when the war gets kicked off. And who knows, that might make a difference. Taiwan itself, that's a big question mark. I mean, they recently did a survey, and I think like only 45% of the populace was in favor of China being in charge. And of that 45%, the majority were young men. So the young men of your nation don't care if China's in charge versus, Taiwan being independent. And that kind of tells you a lot, right? Because in a war, it's your young men that are going to fight, not your elderly, right? So
right.
I kind of question whether it's even worth defending them, right? And with Russia, or China, would just, amphibious assaults are much harder to conduct. They're unproven military. They have the overwhelming forces. So let's say their amphibious assault totally just fails, right? Well, they can just keep throwing bodies at it until it works, right? Whereas Taiwan doesn't have that luxury. Also, they don't have to technically land troops on the island. They can just use they can create a blockade. And at that point, it's basically going to be drones, aircraft, and ships chugging missiles at each other. The U.S., possibly with our Japanese allies, versus the Chinese. And you're just going to have submarines, drones, aircraft, and battle cruisers just lugging missiles at each other. And it's basically going to come down to who achieved a higher kill rate. And if you achieve a high kill rate, and you also have a high production rate to replace those losses, well, then we're going to know who wins, right? So, because remember, you can have a drone go in and take out maybe a mission kill. And what I mean by that is you have a battle cruiser, the drone goes in, does enough damage to the sensors on that battle cruiser that it has to withdraw out of battle space. So it's not destroyed, it's not sunk, but he's no longer in the battle space putting in any work. He has to retreat, get repairs, and all that nonsense. And that can be done with just a drone, like a little drone just flying into, just kamikazing into your sensor suite on your cruiser. So, and China has conducted these kinds of drills on U.S. craft. There's been U.S. craft who have been buzzed by drone swarms. And that's, they have ships that are devoted to just drone launches. So I have no idea how it's going to go down. I just know that it's going to be a slugfest of missiles, maybe an amphibious assault of some kind onto Taiwan's mainland. If that occurs, I don't know if Taiwan's going to put up as strong of a resistance. The young men there don't care. They don't have a fighting spirit. They sit inside playing StarCraft. Do you know what I mean?
It's not
sit inside and play Dota.
What do they have to look forward to? I think that's the most pertinent thing. I mean, for instance, why would I go fight for China, like the demographic of the United States that's competent military force? Why would, either white or East Asian men in America fight for this force that, hates us? Why do I care? Why would I spill my blood? Let the LGBTQ, people that you shill so much, let them spill their AIDS blood, not me. And that's the thing is
exactly,
that...
and that...
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that's another cultural factor here, is that, with all the crap that the United States has done for the past 30 years, and especially since 2010, constant, non-stop anti-white rhetoric and anti-heterosexual rhetoric, non-stop, in all the media, all my music, my movies. You can't even have escapism in American culture anymore because they've infiltrated all the video games. They've infiltrated all my movies and TV shows, so I can't even have proper escapism and play a video game that just, is enjoying, this has really created a rot, right? And we saw something like this happened before in the Vietnam era. You put all this subversion out there, and a whole bunch of people turned against our original policy of containment against communism, particularly China, and everybody turned against the Vietnam War and didn't think it was worth going there and fighting and dying. Even though I would argue that the South Vietnamese were not like the Taiwanese. They were very much in favor of resisting the Chinese forces and fighting. It's just unfortunately their kin in the north were just as determined and just as resilient, maybe even more so. But look what the result was. We had to pull out, and it was a defeat, right? And I think a similar effect is going to take place here. However, I would say this: if China were to launch right now, it would be in their favor, because with a Democrat and president, especially one with such low approval ratings as Biden, you're definitely not going to have. And let's say Biden's like, "Hey, Taiwan's being attacked. We have agreements with them. We need, and they initiate a draft, to get conscripts, right? You're not going to have people show up, right? His approval rating is too low. He's such a piece of shit. No one's going to show up. Okay, even if you were to do that now to fight Russia and Ukraine, it ain't going to happen.
Yeah,
so it would be in
the war support has significantly declined for Ukraine just over 1 year. It's almost like it's an old TV show for us.
Oh yeah, people, yeah. Oh yeah, it's funny. All the bullshit consumerism has like rotted our brains where we can't even hold attention spans or memory of past like a year. It's like people just move on to the next thing. But I think also a lot of Americans kind of see that. Okay, this is like a bullshit. I think they're starting to maybe see through the bullshit that like Ukraine's not going to win and all that. But another thing I was going to say was if China were to invade now, it would be at their advantage. However, let's say in 2024, the propaganda machine here in the United States completely flips right wing. And next you see the media being more anti-LGBT, anti-homosexual, and more pro-white. And you see all these political leaders kind of like flip-flop. And this energy starts to build in the right wing. That, oh my gosh, finally we have like people who are saying what we want to hear and are doing what we want. And they're going to get a Republican president in. I guarantee you, if there's a Republican president in 2024, then we're definitely going to go to war, because more people, more idiots, more just normies are going to be in favor of going to war against China or Russia with a Republican and president than a Democrat. Even if that Republican president runs on a campaign. What's that?
I think that's absolutely accurate.
Right, and that is why I think if we see the right wing pivot happen by definitely by this summer and into the end of 2023, and then definitely in the beginning of 2024, then that's gonna that anyone who sits here and thinks that okay, these right wing people are true patriots and they're actually pro-white and they're actually pro-heterosexual and they're actually
Patriots in charge.
Yeah, all that bullshit. If you think any of these guys are that, you're a complete idiot. A country and a political regime doesn't have a shift like that in less than a year. Okay? That's not how it actually works. For actual true patriots and actual true people, that's a cultural phenomenon that takes years in progression before you get politics to then reflect that. It doesn't happen in just a freaking year, okay? So if this happens, if this occurs, it's going to suck up all the right-wing boomers big time, because they're the most brainwashed. They're the ones that really think that we should be bombing. I mean, even people close to my family that are right-wing, they think that we should be. Some of them think that we should be giving nukes to Ukraine. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous how brainwashed they are. And Zoomers, the youth in this country, are so hollowed out because of the social media and because of how destructive our culture has become, especially since it's been so anti-white male. An aspect of modernity, okay, that's at play here. I mean, we're in the postmodern era, but for the most part, the modernity is still at play. And an aspect of modernity is that you go from a nobody, you go from rags to riches, you go from a nobody to striking luck or striking some breakthrough, and then you become famous, you become wealthy, yada yada yada. An example of that is Captain America. Here's this nobody, he's weak, he's pathetic, and then he has a breakthrough where, you know, they do this experiment on him, and he becomes a super soldier, and then he becomes a hero of the war. Well, if you have a bunch of disenfranchised white men that are full of anger, full of rage, and I get a Republican president in there to say everything they want to hear and cultivate that energy, right? Cultivate that energy by saying everything they want to hear, win a bunch of elections, and during that campaign, they're like, hey, we're not going to go to war with Russia. We're not going to go to war with China. We're just going to stand firm to them, but we're not going to go to war. We're not trying to start a world war here. They're going to say that. They're going to say that they're for peace and they're for whatever, or peace through strength, meaning, you know, not a weak position, but, you know, we're going to negotiate from a place of strength. That way, the energy is cultivated, but they're going to get led right into a war, is what I'm trying to say. Because you have these hollowed out white young men who don't understand what's going on. They don't really understand the technological elite. They don't understand our enemies are in our own government on both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democrat. They do not have your best interests at play. And I believe that the people in power here in the United States already know that the game is up. And they don't want to be, you know, if the U.S. is shifting from a first world hegemon to a second world nation or maybe even third world nation, that means the elite and the oligarchy need to make sure their power is solidified, because what happens in third worlds? Revolutions happen, strife happens, elites get killed, right? Look at Arab Spring, look at these other countries, right? They don't want to be killed. They want to transition into, you know, whoever's going to be the new dog in town. They don't really care, as long as their money's intact, their power's intact here in the country that they control, right? They could see this war as an avenue to get rid of the portion of your populace that's most likely to be a problem in the future. Who would that be? White, straight white men of the founding stock of this country. What better way than to give them what they want briefly, cultivate that energy, get them to get into this war, and then die before they even reach Taiwan, get blown up by a missile, get blown up by a drone. You don't even make it there. How heroic would that be? Or I get sent to Ukraine and I sit in a trench and get blown up by all the various ordinances that Russia has. I never even see a Russian. I never even made it out of the trench.
Forget the fact that you get mutilated, you know?
Yeah, you don't get a proper burial. You're going to be, no one's going to ever see you again. Done. You won't even find your dog tag. You're at the bottom of the ocean.
It's ridiculous. Like, that's the thing, though. The sad thing, though, is that there will be people that fall for it, because here's the thing with propaganda. People assume that propaganda is aimed at people that are high IQ. It's not. It's aimed at the mean. It's aimed at people with 100 IQ or less, and ultimately are willing to fall for it. I mean, let's be honest. Everyone wants to go to war. Like, if you're a red-blooded male, you want to fight. You love fighting. That's something you want to do. And you're giving an excuse not only to fight, but to come off as a hero, to be like someone, you know, that people look up to, and that's what these people want, especially after being disenfranchised for decades now. That's what they want. And so, like, the issue that I find, that I hope people have the good sense to interdict, is if we do go to war and they do call on this population, that they hold back. They hold back and get political power. They hold back their you know, how do you say, support, and they demand the repealing of certain, like, policies which disenfranchise them, you know? And that's something that I doubt really will happen. I think that they'll just go for it because they're just, I mean, that's the thing, is the average person's average. They're not capable of thinking like that. And for whatever reason, in America, we are not very good politicians. We're not good at thinking, well, if I do this, then I'm going to fuck myself over. Instead of thinking, okay, look, like, we have to play politically. We have to be Machiavellian in a way. We have to, like, withdraw our support and make it conditional. And that's something I think most people don't understand.
Yeah, I think you're right on the money. I think there's a portion of the populace that gets it, especially those who served in the GWAT. You know, kind of fool me once, shame on me, or fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me, meaning that they got propagandized, fought the GWAT, got deployed to Iraq, Afghanistan. Now that they're older, they realize that was all bullshit, and they're not going to fall for it again. There is a segment of our population that are there, that have that sentiment, but it's too fractionalized, and they're not leveraging enough influence over the youth. We have to capture Gen Z. We have to capture them. And all your comments just then were 100% correct. And it's just sad that we have a moment right now in history, particularly young white males in the United States, to send a very potent signal to the elite here that your propaganda no longer works. And that scares them more than all the AR-15s we own. Because if we show that we're not going to go to this war and we're not going to get conscripted and just get slaughtered and disposed of, that we're going to stand our ground and stay here, then that immediately tells them that, one, the propaganda no longer works at all. And on the actual target audience, people think that propaganda is, these leftists. No, the leftists are just nothing more than an agent, part of a propaganda machine to get a reaction out of you, the right wing, right? And if we do that, it shows that all that was a failure and that they're going to have a conflict in the near future on their doorstep, at them. And that scares them more because I don't think they really have good solutions to that problem. You know, a global conflict against Russia and China, they don't really care. Yes, they might lose some money. Yes, they might make things a little bit sketchy here for a brief period of time. But it's an opportunity for them to get rid of a problem that is much longer term. Okay? And
if I would add, if I would suggest, if we were to have someone with enough competence to make enumerated demands, things that are achievable under those conditions would be: 1, repeal Title IX. 2, freaking end immigration. 3, send back illegal immigrants. It's so simple. And 4, impose fines on individuals in the political class that have international ties, economic ties, sanctions, etc. Those are very accomplishable material goals we can achieve if you withhold your critical support, because they'll give it. They have no choice. They don't have people. What do you think? A 130-pound, lesbian is going to do anything? No. These people are not competent, and you should see the military, man. The modern military, it's incredible. Even in the Marine Corps, for instance, this focus on emotional stability, on emotional this or that, which is just they don't teach you how to deal with negative emotions. What they do is they teach you to indulge in it, which causes weakness, and it causes, in a military formation, for instance, you're on a beach, you're attacking a headline, you're going to be accepted for breaking down and crying. And that's the thing people don't get, and the critics, women critics of men, don't understand that there is a utility to understanding that you are fearing something, or you're scared or sad or whatever, and repressing those emotions for performance. And that's something they don't get, because obviously they can't understand that there are things beyond emotions, right? Because they think emotionally. And so ultimately, we're filling the military, or rather, we're actually falling dramatically short. The Army, for instance, has had such a huge recruiting lack that it set a record since 1985. You have to understand, this is a half-century problem, and they're claiming that it has to do with this or that, but the reality is people are getting out because of COVID and because of the ramifications of what happened, what they allowed, and also because of the discrimination and because of how weak it is. I mean, you go and it's like you can't be a man, you can't be a soldier or strong, which is what the one career that you are emphasized to be, that it is a virtue to be left in this country. They take it away. Why do they take it away? Because they want political control at the cost of military competence. And I would point to you to add to support my argument is that the rate of naval collisions at sea have increased. The rate of accidental deaths in military maneuvers have increased. The rate of going AWOL has increased. The rate of being incarcerated has also increased within the United States military. And on top of that, we have these crazy freaking, equal opportunity lectures that basically shames you for being a patriotic American. I don't even mean, being something, quote-unquote crazy, like far-right or something. I'm saying, even normicons, that's denigrated. Even just to be an oath keeper or some lame stuff like that, you are considered an extremist terrorist. So why would anyone support this regime? No one should support the war, and that's something that we're going to have to harp on and make sure that if it's the Seventh Fleet that will be sunk, let's make sure that it's everyone that they wanted. Let's make sure it's the pink-haired people, and they spill their grid's blood all over the Southeast China Sea. And basically, they kind of learn their lesson, and we can liquidate a hostile elite, meanwhile also liquidating problems that we have domestically.
Right. This is the time for us to make those kinds of moves.
So anyway, we've gone through roughly, 2 hours of Peter Zeihan's, unpacking, truth from fiction, propaganda from fact, and so I wanted you to just give us a couple more key points, small points, before we just kind of wrap up this war room here.
Yeah, honestly, we hit a lot of the broad strokes and a lot of the, as well as a lot of the more in depth, and some of the major points. Some of the minor points that Zeihan was making, saying how the Chinese health is in horrific condition. Well, we're not even doing as much manufactural labor and hard labor and things like that, and America's health isn't any better. And by the way, when China is no longer doing all that manufacturing and all the pollution and things like that, and they move to a consumer-led economy, the health standards are going to increase, because you need your company to go to a services-led economy, so you're going to have more of the workforce in the healthcare services. So that's kind of like a dumb point that he makes. Literally, the health of a nation can turn around very quickly, especially if they're not bogged down in working conditions in poor facilities, right? So kind of like what happened here in America, we had poor health when we were the manufacturing base of the country and pollution issues, and then all that went away when we offshored it. And even then, we're still unhealthy, and so not kind of a dumb point that he makes there. Russia, he said that Russia's going to go away in 10 years with their demographic issue. No, they're not. Even if they were to lose the war in Ukraine, they're still going to be a juggernaut in oil production. They're still going to be a juggernaut in grain stuff and fertilizers, all of which helps China have access to cheap energy and food inputs that helps their economy. And so that's why this pairing of China and Russia is really what makes a pretty behemoth juggernaut. He made points about the lockdowns and how they were a total failure, when I kind of feel like they weren't a failure. They were more of probably them doing a series of war preparations or gathering information about what their populace can handle, because the sanctions would hurt. That's one of the main comments he makes about China, is that if we were to sanction them, it would be a disaster for them. And I do agree. I don't see how they're going to compensate for the sheer economic ties that they have with the United States and how much they benefit from it. The reason why we're even talking about them being a rival is because we allowed it to happen. We paid all this money and, and they, and put so much manufacturing, it's one thing to make a trade partner and help them develop a little bit more and help them, provide some manufacturing, but the sheer amount of investment, the sheer amount of foreign direct investment and manufacturing that went to China was way more than anywhere else. And they took that money, and now they're positioning themselves to replace us. So, go figure. And there's no way they would be able to, and I don't think their Belt and Road Initiative has gone as well as they say it has. So that's definitely going to be a major challenge to China. But I feel like they have a cheat code, which is, this hyper ethno-nationalist communist regime, and you'll be surprised how quickly people fall in line behind a government force, especially once a foreign enemy is kind of like used as the piñata. So, and then he kind of transitions and talks about Mexico and how we need to continue to partner with them, and they're going to be this great, stabilized country and economy in the future. And it's funny, it's like why would Mexico become more stable? Well, one, they would have to deal with the cartels somehow, right? Because you can't claim to be a stable economy without dealing with that issue. But another reason why they're stable is because they kept sending everybody, all their undesirables, into America, offshoring and lowering their population and making it more manageable and sending people away, right? And now we have to reindustrialize our nation, and we're going to need that cheap labor, and so that's why we have all these immigrants flooding into the country. And he doesn't really mention that. He keeps saying like, everything's setting up wonderful for the United States. We're in a great position. We're in a great position to do this, do that. But yet we have such a horrible demographic issue as well, just like Russia, just like the Eurozone, just like China. But how is the United States regime solving it? All this migration from Central and South America. And it's going to be interesting to see how these migrants will just take any kind of job. So, we need these chip factories because the ones in Taiwan are going to be gone forever. Well, we now have a huge Mexican and Hispanic workforce that we can just shuffle into these factories. So just because we're getting reindustrialized doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a benefit to the American people, particularly those of us on the right wing, those of us who are actual patriots of this country. Okay, you're just importing a migrant force, and then giving them the job, which is still underpaid, which means it trickles all the way up throughout the rest of the economy in the labor market. So it's still not, I feel like that's what a lot of this migration is about, is that if we're going to reindustrialize and sanction China and have this direct conflict as well as economic conflict, you're going to need these workers from somewhere, and that's why our southern border has been so completely unsecured for so long, and why they had to keep grabbing more and more people from, Honduras and El Salvador and Ecuador, and just keep funneling up here in these huge waves, because that's what they're going to do. They're going to be like, okay, chip factory there, injection molding factory there, okay, these migrants there, these migrants go here. That doesn't necessarily mean jobs for the actual Americans who've been sacrificing for generations now in this country, right? So that kind of wraps up, he talked a little bit more about Mexico. We can, talk about that maybe another time, but Mexico is kind of like our Russia. There's lots of cheap energy there, oil. There's lots of cheap natural resources. Or rather, we get cheap natural resources from Canada to the north. And, the United States could lose this war, and it can lose its position against China and Russia. But if we were to go internally, move move us from a globalization to actual internal nationalism and focus on the actual health of the nation, particularly the host race that built this nation, we can have an empire again overnight, or within a few generations. I'm more curious about what this nation, what the oligarchy that are in power, who are clearly anti-Western kind, and don't like the host race that built this nation, what their actual intentions of the future are. And like we said, I don't think this is a position where we can nip that in the bud and actually force that transition earlier instead of being sucked into another global conflict that doesn't look like it'll be, if anything, we won't win. We'll just get a, kind of like a draw, right? And then it creates a new paradigm where we just go back to being the way things were, where all your media is against you, all your institutions are against you, the law is discriminatory against you, and you have all these migrant forces now working in these factories, clogging up our cities, clogging up our countryside. Like, you know what I mean? That future doesn't look great either. This is a moment in time, a transition in an age, and a paradigm shift that we can actually capitalize and steer it in a totally different direction. For us here in the United States, Eurozone, they're going to have to make their own decisions. Other nations are going to have to make their own decisions. But us here in America, this could be a huge pivotal moment that we can capitalize on.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you, and I think that ultimately this is what's kind of in the future. I feel like this is a lot more sober perspective than Zeihan, who's obviously a propagandist for the regime, would want you to perceive the situation to be. Obviously, we have a certain intrinsic bias, which has to be acknowledged, but at the same time, the way that Zeihan has been portraying the situation geopolitically only is used in such a way that's a propagandist perspective. We're trying to parse facts from fiction. Anyway, thank you so much, Celtic War Chief. Thank you for coming back on. I would like to bring you back on, if you're okay with that, for the Mexican operation that's going on and the Guatemalan operation that's going on that's targeting cartels, and see how that affects us as part of organized crime, and what's going to happen with the United States politics in that region.
Sure, that sounds great.
Great. Hey, thank you so much, brother. Thank you for coming on. This is Lance's Legion. This is General Lance, signing off.